Yes. Okay, we are live. Joining me today is a very special guest, Elizabeth Loftus. Thank you very much for joining me. First of all, I really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to talking with you. And I wonder if you could just say, thank you. I wonder if you could say a little bit about who you are and what you do for those who might not know you.
I teach at the University of California, Irvine, the Irvine campus. I'm in a number of different departments, a psychology department, a criminology department, and also the law school. I'm the law school faculty, and I study human memory.
Very good. Okay, and you've been at Irvine for a while now, I guess. It's I don't know exactly when you moved from Washington, is that right?
I did, yeah. I moved in 2002, so okay. It's coming on 19 years here.
Yeah, very cool. It's nice. I'm from Southern California myself, so I have not near Irvine per se, but I know the area. So.
Oh, where are you from? Where?
I was born in La Mirada, which is just a little bit east of LA.
Okay.
Yeah, and then I grew up in that area or whatever, but went to school in the Bay Area in San Francisco. But anyway, so it's great to have you here. I'm very excited to talk to you about your work. So I guess I was going to ask you at the beginning so I know that you got started. I know what you're working on now, but what you got started on was studying semantic memory. Is that right? So, and then you kind of switched over to autobiographical memory, but that's where you started.
When I started studying memory, I was studying semantic memory, which for your listeners who might not know, this is a memory for words and concepts, our memory for our knowledge of the world. So, knowing, for example, that Sacramento is the capital of California is a bit of semantic memory. And I started studying semantic memory because I began to work on a project with a professor while I was in graduate school, continued that work on semantic memory until a few years after I had finished my PhD. And that's when I decided I really want to study something that had a little more obvious practical applicability. And that's when I started diving into eyewitness memory.
Right. And the misinformation effect, which you were one of the first to identify, was something you're very much associated with.
Yes, those early experiments where we showed that information that people are exposed to after some event is completely over can contaminate or distort or transform their memory. It became known as the misinformation effect. And I spent many decades, well, we're still doing studies of the misinformation effect.
Yeah, right. And I think it's a pretty robust finding. At this point, I think it's safe to say that we have a lot of evidence for it. And it's incredibly robust. In fact, it affects people with even very good memory, which I was surprised to find out, even the so-called HSAM population, the highly superior autobiographical memory group. So it's not really, I mean, sometimes people view this as a kind of weakness on their part, like, oh, I get these things wrong, but it just seems like it's a feature of the memory system.
Exactly. It's a way we update our memories in this case with misinformation that, it can sometimes be damaging, but this flexible memory system also can be helpful in some ways for people.
Right. Yeah, I know. I was just reading a more recent, I guess, piece on yours on forgetting and the usefulness of forgetting and the ways in which it's punished sometimes, and especially in the criminal justice system, right? Coming up with alibis and so forth. But that even ordinary persons that aren't under any suspicion at all have trouble coming up with alibis.
No, well, that's another side of the coin here. That people forget, and yet sometimes when people say, I don't remember, they get accused of lying.
Yeah, right.
Malingering, when in fact, it just could be, natural and normal for forgetting. So I have worked on a number of cases where people get accused of perjury and out lying to law enforcement because they say, I don't remember. It sometimes shocks me when I see this happening.
Right. This is partially because of the way they're trained, right? I think that prosecutors are trained to see inconsistencies as evidence of lying or deceitfulness, at least. And that's probably a mistaken way for them to view it, I would say, probably.
Well, it's one thing to have an inconsistency, and sometimes we should be suspicious of those. It's quite another thing when somebody says, I don't remember that. And you can accuse them of deliberately lying and try to punish them. And I think that's what I and the graduate student who I worked with were trying to get across in that essay that you were alluding to.
I see. Okay, right. So there's a difference between forgetting the thing and then having an inconsistency. But isn't it also the case that people, they do have inconsistencies? I mean, I'm recalling the very famous case that you worked on with Cotton. I think Ronald Cotton, was that his name? And his first story was he was with friends, and then he remembered later that he was with his family, and so that was part of the reason why they viewed him with suspicion at the begining. Because
right, yeah. Now I know that case very well, and I've met both Ronald Cotton, the falsely accused defendant who spent time in prison, and the true rape victim, Jennifer Thompson, who was devastated when she learned that she had misidentified him, and he subsequently went to prison. Part of the problem for Ronald Cotton is when they said to him something like, where were you, 2 weeks ago on Tuesday night or whatever it was, he gave an answer, and it turns out the answer was wrong. He was not there at that time. We've since done studies of people's ability to accurately, on the spot, remember where you were 2 weeks ago Tuesday, and they're very bad at it.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And this is not even under high pressure situation. But as you point out in that paper too, is there's this assumption that sometimes is made that people, when there's a lot at stake, that they should be more accurate in their memory. Like when they're really, like a lot hangs on this, you're gonna, but that's not the case, right? The high stakes don't enhance memory recall.
Well, it might be sometimes it can. Sometimes if it is important, you'll take the time to search for corroborating or exonerating evidence. But it's certainly no guarantee that you're going to be perfectly accurate just because it's important.
Right. Yeah, I think these are important lessons. I mean, I guess that the way the criminal justice system is working is starting to incorporate some of these ideas. It's maybe a bit slow, but some of these ideas are working their way into the way prosecutors and other people function. And a large part of it is due to the kind of work that you've been involved with, I would say. So I think that it is surprising to me how much further they still have to go, though, I guess, even though some changes are being made.
Well, we must give credit to the many other people who work in this field who have worked tirelessly to find, to discover, to use their scientific methodology to discover what are good practices that are going to minimize the chances that somebody's going to make a mistake that's going to be devastating for an innocent person. And out of all that work, out of that decades of work has come a number of recommendations. Each one might make a small difference, but they can add up to make a big difference.
Right.
And I'm talking about reforms like using blind testing, where the person who conducts the test does not know who the suspect is. That's been a critical recommendation that has arisen out of all this scientific work in this area. And now different agencies are starting to implement that particular reform.
I mean, that's kind of surprising that they're only just now starting to do that, because that seems like a sort of, shall I say, obvious, like that you can contaminate. I mean, in even more subtle ways, like, you mentioned a case once I saw you talking where, like, the person said to the person who was to identify the lineup, well, I saw you sort of glancing at that guy over there, so why not focus on him a bit more, sort of leading him to identify. And that's, I mean, whether it's, intentional or conscious or not on that person's part, that's definitely a way to contaminate what the person is doing.
Well, I can give these law enforcement clearly the benefit of the doubt, and not, unless you have some other evidence, accuse them of anything intentional. But they have a suspect in mind. They've got a hypothesis about what happened. And they're often not aware that they can communicate their thinking to the person they're interviewing.
Right.
That's happened in that example that you just alluded to.
Yeah, right, exactly. So the more they're aware of their influence, the more careful they can be. But a lot of it depends on, we want to give them the benefit of the doubt, but obviously a lot depends on their personal outlook and what they're hoping to accomplish. Yeah. So I want to get to some of this stuff in a little bit more detail, but I wonder if I could just back up for a second and ask you what's your, I guess, definition of memory is. Because I see, like in some of your work and some of your writings, that there's at least three elements. There's the sensory element, there's the belief element, and then there's like a judgment element. So I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about how you think about just what the nature of memory in general is and what distinguishes it.
I think of memory as a process. We are, exposed to information. We acquire bits of information into a memory system. It doesn't just sit there waiting to be kind of plucked out later, but we can then, it fades over time. We can be exposed to new information that can also enter the system and can contaminate what is there. But, memory is a process by which we store information and try to retrieve it later when we want to remember something or answer somebody's questions, testify in court. I mean, that's in a nutshell what memory is.
Right. So, I mean, I guess the reason why I'm asking this is because I see a lot of times when you're writing about this, and even when you're speaking, what you say is that your subjects remember and believe.
Oh, well, okay. We do make a distinction between having a belief that something is true and having a memory that something is true and happened to you. And these are very different things.
Right.
You can believe that something is true without having any kind of sense of recollection. So even with true experiences, you can believe that you were born and an umbilical cord had to be cut. I believe that's true of me. But I don't have any memory of that experience. And that shows you an example of with a true event where you can have a belief, but not an actual memory. Same thing is true with false beliefs and false memories. So some of the suggestive techniques that I and others have been worrying about have led to patients to have a belief that maybe they were sexually abused by their father for 10 years, even though they don't have any feeling of recollection. But you go a little further with people with highly suggestive techniques, and now you can get them to start to actually feel like they're remembering things that aren't necessarily true. So I hope that helps clarify a little bit this distinction between having a belief and having a memory. Sometimes we lump them together. Sometimes we talk about these two different subjective experiences.
Yeah, that does help. And so do you, in your work with subjects, try to distinguish these two things? I mean, so how do you know that someone is remembering something? I know you ask them questions about the clarity of the memory and things of that nature, but is this the what you're trying to get at when you're asking those questions?
No, no, actually in some of my later work where we planted a false memory that you got sick eating a particular food, like you got sick eating strawberry ice cream as a child, and then people don't want to eat strawberry ice cream as much anymore. We actually asked them, do you believe it's true of you that you got sick? Do you actually have a memory of a time when you think you got sick? Or do you think it didn't happen to you at all? So sometimes get their own self-report of whether they have a belief or a memory. And I don't know whether, how familiar you are, Richard, with the kind of basic, more theoretical work in the area of human memory. But this distinction between a belief and a memory is kind of like the well-known remember no distinction in the memory literature, where Tulving, the famous memory scientist, I helped to popularize the idea of asking people, you say you saw that word on the list. Do you actually kind of feel it was there? Or do you truly remember seeing it there? And you can tell me, what color were the letters printed in? And was it in early in the list or later in the list? Does it feel like you remember, or does it just feel like you know? And our distinction between a belief and a memory is kind of analogous to that distinction that's had a long history.
Yeah.
The science of memory.
Yeah, that helps. Yeah, that makes sense, because they are clearly different. And so I think the studies you're talking about are where you like give the list of words like candy and so forth, and you ask it was sweet on the list, and people tend to think that it was. They pick that out of the lineup. And then so
Yeah.
the distinction between, do they just know it, like, or did they actually have this feeling of recalling it? And that's what the belief versus memory thing is. So that's, and often you get them to do both, or did you just single out the subjects according to whether they have one or the other of these two things, or?
No, we report what we're observing.
Yeah.
What percent of people tell us that it's a full-blown memory, and what percent tell us it's just a belief?
I see. Okay. Yeah, because I guess some of the criticisms that I've seen try to harp on this distinction and say, well, maybe they're just believing it, but they're not really. Like, how do you know that they're really remembering it? And it seems like you can ask these kind of questions, make these distinctions, and so nail down which one it is that they're actually doing.
Right. Sometimes let them classify when you explain to them the distinction, but sometimes you infer it. So when they say, for example, that they saw sweet on a list of words when it wasn't presented to them at all, and they've conjured up this false memory. If you say to them, do you remember whether it was printed in red ink or black ink? And they give you an answer. Do you remember whether it occurred early in the list or towards the end of the list? I mean, often they'll give you an answer. And so when they expand with this extra detail about this experience, it's a clue that it actually feels like a memory to them.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I don't find these kind of criticisms very convincing. I find the work that, I mean, not just your lab, but like this has been all over the place, right? There's labs all over the world doing this kind of work now. So I think this is a pretty solid result. But I am interested to hear your response to some of these things, which is why I'm asking. So now also, I mean, another very famous example of this is when you view the car crash and you ask them the leading questions: how fast was it going when they smashed, or how fast was it going when they hit? And people give you different judgments there. But do you think, again, you can make this distinction between that they're believing it after the fact, or they're literally remembering the cars going different speeds?
Well, again, we didn't ask that question back then, but just the idea that a week later they're telling us they saw broken glass that didn't exist,
right,
was a clue at the time that I was doing that early work that maybe those leading questions were actually contaminating their memory. And that's what kind of shifted my thinking away from, we're not just studying how changing a word or two and how you question someone can affect what they tell you. We're studying something much more profound, how a word or two can actually contaminate the memory, but it's just one way to do that. People get contaminated when they talk to other people, when they get media coverage about an event they might have witnessed. These are different ways that new information can distort or transform somebody's memory.
Yeah, because you might think that maybe what's going on is they're confabulating. They're sort of, making up something, embellishing, adding details, as opposed to recalling it. But of course, I mean, I guess given what we know about reconsolidation of memories, the idea would be that this information is then sort of put into the memory itself and then recalled later. That's evidence that it's more than
how the reconsolidation people would think about this. But you could also ask the question, whatever's going on in there, whatever's going on in that brain, if they're willing to get on the stand and say, the cars were going, 40 miles an hour and it blew through a stop sign, when that's not true.
Right.
That's kind of what's important.
Right, exactly. And the amount of things that you can get people to falsely remember, I mean, some of them are quite comical. And I've seen, your response to people saying, well, some of these, things may have actually happened and they're like, they're lost in the mall. Some criticisms of that was like, maybe they were lost in the mall. You're like, fine, well, let's see if they can remember, meeting Bugs Bunny or being licked by Goofy. So it's not simply, I mean, I don't think that criticism really carries any weight because of these follow-up studies.
Yeah, once we did the Lost in the Mall study where we found we could plant a memory that you were lost when you were 5 or 6 years old. Remember, it's a particular place and a particular age and with particular family members present, and you're crying and you're frightened and you're rescued by an elderly person, you're reunited. It's not just you were lost sometimes somewhere in childhood. That would be quite as interesting as the result that we got, which is getting some people to believe partially or completely in this completely made up experience. And the main, another criticism that we got back then was getting lost is common. Show you can do this with something that would have been more bizarre or upsetting. And lots of other investigators, and we too, responded to that challenge. And you had, one group at the University of Tennessee planning a false memory that you nearly drowned and had to be rescued by a lifeguard, or another group in Canada planning a false memory that you're attacked by a vicious animal. Another group in Canada planning a false memory that you committed a crime as a teenager and it was serious enough that the police came to investigate. So you can plant all kinds of pretty rich, detailed recollections into the minds of ordinary, otherwise healthy people.
The police one, that's from Julia Shaw's lab. Is that the one you're referring to?
Well, that was when she was at UBC working with Porter, and the paper is, with Shaw and Porter.
Right.
And she found quite a high percentage of people falling sway to the suggestion and developing the false memory.
Right. And so, I mean, one of the other things that I hear people say sometimes is that, well, these techniques involve, the family being co-conspirators. And when you try to transfer this over to talk about, childhood experiences or something like that, then obviously like in therapy, they're not saying the parent is corroborating this or something like that. But I think one of the interesting things that you've done recently is to find techniques that don't involve using the kind of the conspirator aspect.
That's true. And, some of the other techniques that were modeled after the kind of thing we saw going on in some questionable psychotherapy, things like guided imagination. You don't remember anybody molesting you, but you've got all the symptoms of somebody who was abused as a child. Why don't you just close your eyes and try to imagine who might have done this to you and where might you have been? Well, what does that imagination exercise do to people who didn't have the experience? And in a series of studies, different investigators have shown that imagination can increase your confidence that you had the experience that you're merely imagining. So then there's a dream interpretation. And I've seen sexualized dream interpretation lead people to false memories. And in some studies, we showed that, you bring in a clinician to do some dream interpretation, excuse me, and you can get people to start to think they remember the stuff that they told you they dreamt about after you apply them with suggestion that dream is tapping into a real memory.
So it's one of the questions that I have is, I think the evidence against repression is significant, at least in the way that Freud thought of it, right? I don't think there's much evidence for that, if any, actually. But so one of the things you talk about in one of your papers is the difference between forgetting and repression. So people do forget things and then they do remember them later, right? So it's not impossible that someone could spontaneously remember something from childhood 20 years later, right? That's not what you're ruling out here.
No, you're absolutely right. People cannot think about things for a long time. They can be reminded of them, and then it feels like a memory, and it can be a reasonably accurate memory. People cannot think about even very unpleasant things and get reminded of them. And you just have to go to a high school reunion. You can experience this for yourself. But that's ordinary forgetting and remembering. What's being claimed in these cases, many of which entered courtrooms, is something that is too extreme to be explained by ordinary forgetting and remembering. You were raped between the ages of 5 and 16, forced to have sex with the family dog, all allegedly repressed into the unconscious, and you had no awareness of it until you were 19 or 18 or 19 and went into therapy. Just where is the proof that memory routinely works like that, if ever?
Right. And in fact, I think we have lots of reason to believe that it's the opposite. I mean, from the phenomena of flashbulb memories and emotionally charged memories, those sorts of things, they're very difficult to get over when they're really truly traumatic in the way that they're describing. They don't tend to be the sorts of things that you forget easily.
Well, yeah, and when you're dealing with somebody who's had a horrible experience, and particularly if they've got post-traumatic stress disorder, that they've got the opposite problem. They've got intrusive memories. They can't stop thinking about these experiences, and that can be quite debilitating.
Yeah. So one criticism that I've seen that I think that I would be interested to hear you talk about is this sort of reverse of this. So the results that you have and others have discovered suggest that you can be or susceptible to these false memories, misinformation, etc. This can be definitely done in the therapeutic sessions, but isn't there also the potential that abusers can alter memory of those who have been abused? Maybe not but certainly with misinformation, not by guided techniques or something like that. But isn't that a possibility as well, that people could not remember having these things happen to them because of misinformation provided by the people who are abusing them?
People have asked me about erasing memories. We've actually tried to kind of take memories away from people. It's a lot harder to do. What you can do is substitute a memory. So in some sense, when we make you believe that the car went through a stop sign instead of a yield sign, we're in some sense weakening that memory for the yield sign as we substitute this alternative detail that people are embracing and accepting as their own memory. So in that sense, you're sort of removing a memory. It's hard to imagine how an abuser is going to be able to do that. I mean, in principle, I suppose you could substitute one act for another and maybe get somebody to believe that they really only put their hand on your knee rather than put their hand on your upper thigh near the crotch. I mean, by possibly repeating that, in principle, I guess you could do that.
Right, but it sounds like what you're saying is that that's a lot more difficult than the kind of things which we're talking about here, getting people to believe things that never happen, as opposed to
getting people, taking away a memory is a little harder, but substituting one detail for another is certainly possible. So I was just thinking in principle, and I kind of came up with this one example because it's kind of related to a case I'm working on now. I've twisted all the details, of course. Let's say that a perpetrator put his hand in a sort of inappropriate spot and later on kept on telling the victim that he put it in an innocent spot. Maybe you could get the person to remember it as being more innocent.
Right, but you couldn't get them to forget or to think that that nothing had happened, that there was no touching at all.
It depends. I mean, as that person went on in life and experienced many other traumas and difficulties and the ups and downs of natural life, a touching incident that might fade in their memory.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I know this is slightly off the topic, but I know that there's this question about what happens in the substitution case. So if you go through the stop sign and then later you suggest to them that it's a yield sign, and then people um, report back that you ask them what they saw, they say, I saw the yield sign. There's a question about what happened to the original memory. So is that information still retained? Is it written over? Did you have a view about that now? Because I know.
Well, first of all, you've been doing your homework here. I have, because that was a fundamental issue. When you distort somebody's memory and make them believe in a detail that's different from the original detail, what happened to the original memory trace? And we duked it out in the pages of the Journal of Experimental Psychology and other places, for years, trying to ask what happened to those underlying memory traces when new information invades you and you accept it. And, where I think it ended up, and we stopped arguing, and maybe around 1990s or something, 20 years ago, is that when somebody gives you a wrong answer, there are many routes to that wrong answer. There are many routes. Sometimes they didn't pay very good attention to the original and they've just adopted your suggestion and added it to memory. Sometimes they have a conflict. They think, I thought I saw one thing, but this person who's questioning me talks about a different thing. I think they probably know what they're doing. I'll go with their detail. That's resolving a conflict in favor of the erroneous information. And sometimes it does look like in the process of absorbing this new misinformation, it does weaken your original memory. So all of these things can be going on some of the time.
Right. So unfortunately, the answer is complicated.
Yeah. But scientists have not been, discussing all this quite as much as they did back in the 80s.
Yeah, right. I read some of those papers, and then they sort of just disappeared. I don't know if I was wondering if that's because the issue was kind of settled, or if people just lost interest. But it sounds like what you're saying is, well, we sort of just found out that all of it happens.
Exactly. Well, that was my conclusion at some point. Everybody was a little right.
Yeah, exactly. The best kind of debate outcome.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, I mean, obviously the sensory part then one of the things that can happen is that the sensory component gets altered, right? You might actually visualize the yield sign when you recall the memory as a result of the false information.
Well, that can happen. Yeah. But if you want to talk about sensory memory, that very early stage, then I would talk to a different cognitive psychologist.
Yeah. No, I don't mean like iconic memory or something like that. What I mean is the sensory component of these kinds of memories.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, because I think that part of what you guys call a memory is that there's the visualization part, like, the imagistic part, not the sensory, not in that technical sense of sensory memory, but at least like a sensory component. And then also the feeling of it being recalled or something like that, plus the belief that this is something that happened. And so I was just curious about whether that part of the memory can be altered because of the misinformation, or whether it's, and I was also thinking this because I read a couple papers by you and colleagues where you looked at the fMRI data and were trying to see what the difference between, false memories and vertical memories are. And they're very similar overall, but there are some differences like in the visual cortex and so forth, where you would expect then there would be a difference in the imagistic component.
Well, there were a few differences in the neuroimaging studies between a true memory and one that you believe is true, but happens to not be true. But I think the overwhelming impression from that work is the similarity of the neural signals. And clearly, the differences are so small that you're not going to be able to take one individual memory and reliably classify it as a true, authentic memory versus a false memory that arises from some other process. So that's what the courts have to deal with. They get somebody on the stand with a specific memory. Are you going to stick them into an fMRI machine and have the machine decide whether it's real or not? I don't think so. Not for a long, long time.
So you don't even think if there were like machine learning, like if you had multivariate pattern analysis of these sorts of things, and then you sort of had a decoder train up on the
I
vertical, like
don't,
remember something true, remember something false. You don't think that you could use those techniques to distinguish?
I think they have better luck with those techniques when you're trying to distinguish somebody telling the truth versus a deliberate lie.
Uh-huh.
But I think they've had much less success trying to get a distinction between something that is true and something that's false, but you believe it true.
Right. Yeah, that's a tough distinction. But I was intrigued that there were at least some differences that you can see in the fMRI. Although you're right. I mean, looking at the data, they're overwhelmingly similar, right? So to the naked eye, I couldn't tell the difference between the two.
Mhm.
But I was wondering if some machine learning or some algorithm could be trained to sort of sniff out the differences that maybe.
Well, you talk to Wagner at Stanford about that. See what he has to say.
Okay. Yeah.
This is veering, and I teamed up with people who really know how to do fMRI and how to talk about it. But and I just tagged on with their expertise when we did that joint work.
Okay, very cool. Yeah. So another thing that I think that came up a little bit earlier, but I would like to circle back around to, was the actual real world effects that these false memories have. So you mentioned the strawberry ice cream, and also, you could get people to like healthier foods like asparagus. And I know your joke about George Bush, and you'd like to get him to eat some broccoli. So I think that's hilarious. But these things having these real world effects, I mean, these are beneficial in a sense if you use them in the right way, convincing people. And I just read this paper by you on memory blindness, where you can convince people that the pain wasn't as bad. And so although there were some mixed results, I guess, at the end about how effective that was in them making a decision, but nonetheless, so these things actually manifest in the real world. And so, I mean, I don't know what your views are ultimately about whether this is ethical to do or not, but it seems like a good idea, actually.
But I started thinking about this when we had a collection of these results on the food memory that you've just alluded to, where we could get people to develop a false memory that they got sick on a fattening food and they didn't want to eat the food that much, or that they had a warm, fuzzy memory with a healthy food like asparagus, and they're more interested in asparagus. And I started thinking, if you could plant false memories, control people's nutritional selections, couldn't this be kind of a dieting technique? Couldn't this, help reduce the obesity problem in our society? Maybe minimize the chances that people will have diabetes and a shortened lifespan and all the things that go along with obesity. And wouldn't that be a good thing? And, in principle, I think it would be a good thing. And probably it would be a technique that a lot of people would sign up for if opened up a shop and offered it.
Exactly. Yeah, I know. I would volunteer for that. I mean, so what's the basic idea? You tell them that they got sick eating a certain food, or that they really enjoyed. So take the strawberry ice cream. I think it was done with peach yogurt too. That's another famous one, right? And this is all
peach. Well, that was Scaboria and colleagues who did the peach yogurt. A beautiful study. He passed away sadly, but he was in Canada and he had collaborators, and they planted a false memory that you got sick eating peach yogurt. And even, weeks and weeks later, people weren't as interested in having peach yogurt. And he actually allowed people to eat, yogurt, measured the containers and how much they weighed after the subject ate. And it was a beautiful.
Oh, really? Okay. I didn't know that. So, because I thought one of the questions was whether this would, whether when you were confronted with the food itself in real life, whether you would really follow through. And so what you're saying is they did that. I didn't realize.
Yeah, they did that. Yes.
And they ate less of the peach yogurt.
A feature of the peach yogurt work. Yeah. It was a beautiful example.
And this was weeks later where they were still more reluctant to eat the peach yogurt?
Yeah, I think it was weeks, maybe a month later. I mean, it was quite a while later.
Wow. Okay.
I probably have the paper on my computer if you want me to send it to you.
Oh, wow. Thank you. Yeah, I would like to read it.
Yeah.
So And the same is true with the healthy foods. So they're more likely to eat the healthy foods if you implant a memory that what they had, that they liked it as a kid or they enjoyed it when they ate it.
Well, it was planting a warm, fuzzy memory, childhood memory involving asparagus. We didn't actually put the food in front of them, but we asked them questions about what they would intend to order if they had a chance to be, at a restaurant on a special occasion, and these were on the menu. And they were more interested in asparagus.
Interesting. So, but they have to buy the false memory, right? If they don't accept the false memory, then you don't get the effect.
I can't remember in all the difference. Definitely, once they buy into it, then you see this effect. What happens with people who were exposed to the suggestion but didn't fall for it? I think that middle group behaves a little differently in the different studies that have been done on this.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. I mean, yeah, I'm trying this on my son right now. I was like, well, last time we ate this, you really liked it.
Okay, well, there you go.
Yeah, well, it hasn't worked so far. I think he's a little bit resistant. But I know some people are critical of this because they're like, oh, well, this is, you're lying to the children. And I like your responses, like hello, Santa Claus, which I've heard you say. So I agree that there is this kind of double standard with respect to lying to children in this.
Yeah, exactly. But, when what I then said more seriously than hello, Santa Claus was, again, if you had an overweight or obese teenager or child, I mean, which would you rather see? A little bit of fiction floating around in their memory, but they're healthier and they have, a longer lifespan, or the alternative. And people can make different choices. I'm not going to make those choices for them, but I know what I prefer for a kid of mine.
Yeah, I agree. I think that part of the reason, when we talk about this, and I teach general psychology, and talk about these things, and one of the things I see undergraduates and kind of the lay person, so to speak, say is they really get, pent up about messing with memories because it's so personal, and we really identify ourselves with like our memories, and it's really part of our self-identity in a sense. And so I think people, we talk about memory dampening or memory alteration or any of those sorts of things, they get very uneasy about it. And do you think that, is this, do you think based on, well, first of all, I wonder if you agree with me about that. And secondly, I wonder if you think that this is in part based on this erroneous model of how memory works, that it's veridical and like little snippets and, so forth.
Well, I'll tell you what I learned in thinking about memory dampening, which you mentioned in your question. First of all, there were clinical trials of a drug called propranolol, where you could supposedly give this drug to, let's say, somebody who came to a hospital in the emergency room after experiencing a horrible trauma. You could give them this propranolol, and it would weaken their memory and minimize the chances that they would develop post-traumatic stress disorder, which can be a very debilitating condition. And I found this work so fascinating, but I wasn't in a position with my lab to actually study propranolol. But what we could do is ask people, if you were in that situation, if you were in the emergency room after a horrible trauma and somebody offered you this drug, would you take it? And personally, I said to myself, yes, I would take it because I don't want the pain. I want to minimize the pain, and I certainly don't want post-traumatic stress disorder. But one of my collaborators on this project said, no, I wouldn't take it. Then when we went out and asked a general population, would you take the drug? We give them a scenario, you're a manager and a foods, like a Burger King kind of thing. You're carrying the money home at the end of the day because you're going to deposit it the next morning, and you're beaten up in the park, and you in the emergency room, and somebody offers you this drug. And just to my surprise, most people were like my collaborators. They said, no, I don't want this drug.
Wow.
Change the scenario a little, they still didn't want the drug. And this is what, they didn't know what the side effects would be. What other memories would it take away? They had different reasons, but it really taught me that people are scared of having their memories be taken away.
Right.
They cherish those memories, even when the memories might be bad for them. And that was a real lesson. And I actually got invited to the Toronto Film Festival right around the time of having done this work, where the film audience watched Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, or whatever. Do you know that film where they try to wipe away any remnant of their romantic relationship after a breakup?
Yeah.
And so I was able to talk with this audience about the film, whether that was feasible, and whether people would really want to do that. Sounds kind of tempting if you had a painful breakup, but
Yeah.
I bet people would have some qualms based on, the work that we did on the memory dampening drugs.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's something that I talk with them a lot about too. So I say, what if you failed a test, or it was really, not even a breakup, but just, you were really disappointed in your performance in the class or something. Would you do this to move on with your life? And they'd be like, no. There's the sense that, it's unearned, I think. I was like, well, what's the difference between that and going out and drinking all night and then you forget the next day? They somehow think it's more respectable to do the drinking. So
that's a great pedagogical little exercise there, Richard. I like that a lot, to think about, why is it different from drinking to forget or whatever?
Exactly. These things that,
yeah.
The answer is that we've done that for a long time already. So we sort of know what the trade-offs and so far are. But I do think, and, even there was this, the president's bioethics council, they wrote a big screed about this back in the, I guess in the late 90s or early 2000s, I forget when exactly. But I just think that, we're not ready to come to terms as a society yet with what we're learning about memory. People are very resistant, and the layperson has this general view that memory is reliable, and that, and it presents itself that way. You can't deny that. Like from the inside, it really seems like this is what happened. And then you find out, whoa, you weren't wearing that red sweater. You were wearing, there's a picture of you in the yellow sweater. So we have these kinds of experiences, but nonetheless, we put a lot of faith in our memory. And I think the more you learn about the memory science, the more that's brought into question, but I don't think it's percolated out into the average person yet. Do you think that would be beneficial if they came to understand these things?
I feel that understanding the malleable nature of memory can only help people. I mean, even in my own life, I do feel that it's given me an appreciation about the commonness of mistakes, and it makes me more tolerant of the mistakes that friends or family members or even I myself might make. I don't immediately assume somebody is deliberately lying. They just have a false memory.
Right. And I mean, this is, prominent cases too. I mean, I know the Brian Williams one you talk about, and there's also the Hillary Clinton one, where these people were attacked. And, when I talk to people about this, they still judge, we were to trust him, and he was lying this whole time to beef up his resume. And I know you have this recording that you play that I thought was very interesting of a message that someone left you.
Oh my gosh, that was such a weird message. Well, I did play that in a couple of talks. So did you hear a talk I gave where I played this?
Yeah, I did.
Answering machine message from somebody when all I was trying to do was suggest that maybe Brian Williams could have really had a false memory and how it would have arisen. I mean, I followed that whole thing. Of course, I only have newspaper knowledge of what happened to him, but it's a pretty interesting example. And I use it and the Hillary Clinton example to show how even the most educated, intelligent, experienced among us can develop false memories that are sometimes embarrassing for them.
Absolutely. But there is, if I'm not mistaken, there is a correlation with intelligence and resistance. Is that correct? Like if you have score high on measures of intelligence, then
That
it's harder?
No, that correlates. If you are somewhat low in standard tests of intelligence, you're somewhat more susceptible. But we're dealing with correlations on the order of about 0.3 or so, and so they're not overwhelming. It's just a tendency.
Yeah, and so there's nothing one like can do to inoculate oneself against these effects. Or do you know of any technique? I know that being told that you're going to have misinformation before you get it has some mitigating effect. But is that really the only thing that you guys have found?
Well, if you warn people that you may be exposed to misinformation and you have this warning in the forefront of your consciousness, you can do certain things that'll make you a little more resistant to the suggestive influence.
But is there anything else? I mean, there's no like exercises or memory techniques that one can employ?
Not that I know of, no.
Yeah. It's too bad. I know. And I know also that you've been working recently on the effects of marijuana, for example, on susceptibility, and the findings there are not good.
Well, that's a group in the Netherlands. They're the driving force behind that paper, and and they are driving the train. But I was fortunate enough to be able to have a bit of a collaboration in which we showed that marijuana does make people a bit more susceptible to post-event contamination. Done with kind of a virtual reality setup, so it was kind of cute that way. But people can read that paper. I think I have a link to it on my UC Irvine website, where I've got 50 articles that people can just download for free and read for themselves.
Yeah, I'll put a link to that in the description over here as well. But so, I mean, that's kind of worrying, right? Because this is a widely used drug, which is becoming more and more legalized. And it's already highly used, but this has a real implication for testimony and witness accounts and so.
Well, and we've had that problem with alcohol for a long time too. So. Right. I've just gotten a copy of a big review paper out of this Netherlands group that I'm just starting to dive into, which is going into a whole bunch of different drugs, not just cannabis, but also alcohol and other drugs, and the false memory problem. So,
interesting.
When I digest all this, I'll have more to tell you about.
Okay, cool. So, and one other thing I was curious about is that the overall rate, I've seen different estimates, and I know that there was a big like mega analysis in 2017, I think, but so you see numbers anywhere from like 20 to sometimes 50, sometimes 60. So what do you think on average, the success rate of these techniques are?
Well, these are the rich false memory studies.
Right.
They're not changing a detail, turning a stop sign into a yield sign, or making you believe that the bad guy had a brown jacket instead of a green jacket. That's super easy to do. These rich false memory studies, where you plant an entirely false memory into the minds of people for something that didn't happen, those constitute the studies that are analyzed in the mega analysis, headed by Scaboria, but also including co-authors from Britain and Canada and US. And what they found is that using a common coding scheme, about 30% of subjects developed a false memory, and an additional 23% developed a false belief that the event happened. And this is just with a few suggestive interviews. Remember, in psychotherapy, sometimes you are interviewed week after, or talking week after week after week, more than just a few. So I think that mega analysis is pretty telling.
Right. Yeah. Some of these, I think you're right that there's a much different effect from weeks or years of these kind of techniques as opposed to just a couple of interviews. So 30%, I mean, that's pretty high, but it also suggests that, 70% don't fall for it, which I guess is good.
The additional 23% who develop a false belief.
Oh, is that additive? So that the total is
53 or whatever, but that sometimes the false belief is the first step down that royal road to developing a full-blown false memory.
Right.
often the way it starts. You start to get somebody to believe this happened to them, even though they don't have any sense of recollection. Then they work on it, they imagine, they think about it. And that false belief turns into a full-blown false memory. So
that's pretty depressing then, if about half of people are susceptible to these things.
well, that's in this collection of studies that were analyzed using the common coding technique for the mega-analysis.
Right, yeah.
And I'm not sure I'd want to go quite so far as to say, this means that 53% of people in the world,
Right.
But it's a clue that this is easier to do than some people might think.
And more widespread than we might think as well. Do you have any guesses about why? So I know that like I grew up in the 80s, and, the satanic panic was very much prevalent, and, there was recovered memories all the time of, abuse, but it was like very specific abuse about, being impregnated by Satan, or, being child trafficked, and with ritual abuse and so forth and so on. Do you have any ideas about why those specific, why? So coming up with I was abused is one thing. Coming up with these like very specific and weird scenarios is like another thing. So I'm curious if you have any.
Well, my speculation is they get in the hands of therapists who've got that belief system. It's not that different from the many people in our society who believe they were abducted by aliens, taken up on spaceships, sexually experimented upon, then returned to their beds on Earth. How does that happen? They ended up in the clutches of people who believe that this is real. They, like Dr. John Mack, a psychiatrist from Harvard, who's seemingly very credible. He's since passed away, but he hypnotized his people, and they went all the way to these pretty extreme beliefs.
So you think it really is just a product of that the therapist had this antecedent belief that it must be something like that?
I think that's one route. And then, of course, some of these people go on talk shows and they talk about their experiences, and they can influence other people that way who watch the talk shows. And maybe something like that happened to me. And sometimes people get into group therapy situations where people are sharing these stories. That's another route for potential contamination.
Yeah, interesting. Because it does seem like it died out for a bit. And I don't hear as much about.
Yeah, no, there's still a little ritual abuse contingent going on in this.
Oh, is there? Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's really sad. Because no one wants to minimize abuse, obviously. That's not what's going on here. Abuse does happen. Obviously, people are abused. It's horrific.
Absolutely.
But this is not making things. I guess sometimes people say, well, why are you intervening in these cases and so forth? I think what the answer is, and hopefully you'll say as well, but that you see the kind of techniques that are being used to elicit the memories. And that's really an alarm bell, really. That's really the thing that signals that something may be going on that's not legitimate.
Well, yeah. And when you see somebody go from, I had a wonderful, happy childhood, and, sending all these adoring Mother's Day and Father's Day cards to their parents for years and years. They end up going into therapy, deciding that their parents, raped them in satanic cults, and, were the king and queen of the cult, and that they were forced to kill animals and breed babies and kill those babies. Something happened.
Right. Yeah. And you make the point too, as well, that some of the things which are remembered are just impossible. Like, I guess there's cases of, riding on flying animals and being flushed down the toilet. And so that's also a bit needs to be accounted for. That not every part of the memory that's being recalled can be veridical.
Right. Well, we've seen lots of cases where people remember things that are impossible.
Right.
Impregnated by a father who had a vasectomy, having an abortion when there's absolutely no physical evidence of that there ever was a pregnancy, let alone an abortion.
Yeah, right. And so it's also interesting. It seems like repression is making a bit of a comeback as well. The whole concept of repression people are seemingly interested in. And I know I mean, I don't have a background in therapeutic stuff. My background is in cognitive neuroscience, especially related to consciousness, but I do have some familiarity with these other things as well. But so, in our circles, repression is not necessarily taken that seriously, but in therapeutic circles, it does seem like people have been using it for a while, and it does. And now I'm seeing a little crossover. It seems like that even some in the scientific community are starting to think, well, maybe there's some evidence for something like repression, if not like the way Freud thought, then something about it.
Well, that's true. I've got another paper that, co-authored with one of my former graduate students. Are the memory wars over? Wow. And a survey from just a few years ago. Basically, there's still a big gap with memory scientists and even clinical university researchers, believing one thing, but many practitioners still believe something else and are still embracing this idea of repression. So we do see that the memory wars are not over, and there is quite a gap in the thinking of different groups of people about these issues.
Yeah, so I mean, it seems like it would be good to have more crosstalk between the two groups. But do you see that happening, like in your when you go to conferences or you're involved in these activities? Are there people that are there from the other side there as well, or is it like two separate realms?
Well, it depends on what the conference is. I mean, I've had a couple of experiences with the Erickson Foundation, which puts on a huge conference for mental health professionals. And so I've had a chance to at least speak to that audience. And I'm sure they're also hearing from other people who disagree with me.
Right. What do you think of the criticisms that you've heard? Are there any that make you rethink these things, or think that you need to work on more, or do you think that most of them are dealt with in the ways that we've been talking about?
I'm not sure. I think in the very beginning, 20 years ago, I thought, when I first started thinking about repressed memory, when I was working on a murder case where the only evidence against the accused defendant who was accused of committing this murder 20 years earlier was the repressed and recovered memory of his daughter, and then he's convicted. I was fairly shocked that somebody could be convicted based on nothing other than this claim that I saw this, I repressed my memory, now it's back. Ultimately, he was let out of prison. His conviction was overturned. But, even at that time, I thought maybe there is some good evidence of repression. But over these last 20 years, as people have tried to find the evidence and provide the evidence, I don't see any credible scientific support for the idea that you can be, raped for 10 years, wall off all these memories, be completely unaware that this happened, reliably recover this in some therapy, and then you're cured in the process. This is what Richard McNally, the prominent Harvard clinical psychologist and professor, has called folklore.
Right. So why, I mean, I'm just curious then why it's so resistant in the therapeutic circles or in this other camp. But I know it's a handy therapy, it's a handy way to make sense of like what's going on, but it's curious to me why they're so recalcitrant in this sense, or what it is. I wonder from their point of view, what it is that convinces them that this is a real phenomenon, in spite of like you say, 20 years of not finding good evidence for it.
Well, I think if invite somebody to come on your program and talk about it. I mean, I think they'll probably say is, I see it in my practice. What I've seen the psychiatrist who decided that, that Holly Ramona's memories were real of her father raping her between 5 and 16 were real because she had an aversion to pickles, bananas, and mayonnaise. One of my colleagues said, "Oh, it's the fundamental theory of." I mean, but
That's
I'm
rough.
not sure what they will tell you. But have them on and ask them that question. I'd love to listen in.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I haven't done that, but I should. Let's see. I see we're running. I don't want to keep you forever, and I know you have other things to do, but I am curious. Just if this is ostensibly, so we're supposed to be, a show about consciousness. So I do wonder, do you think there's any connection between the kind of work that you're doing and consciousness, or is this something that you think is outside of your? Because I think some people could see the kinds of things you do as evidence for maybe particular views on consciousness. So I'm just curious if you have any thoughts about that.
I don't know. I used to co-author an introductory psych textbook. And so we would have a chapter on consciousness. And I think about the work on altered states of consciousness, like hypnosis being something that can alter your state of consciousness. Following that path, the problem, hypnosis does enter into this realm for me. I've got no problems with people who want to use hypnosis to get people to stop smoking or lose weight or whatever, some good purpose. But in my world, hypnosis is sometimes used to dig out allegedly buried trauma memories. And I think it's potentially a dangerous thing to be doing.
Yeah. Do you think hypnosis is, like you just said, really an altered state of consciousness, as opposed to, I know there's some like the social theory of it that they're, play acting along, or, so do you have a view about that?
I'm not sure, because when I subjected myself as a grad student to be a subject in a hypnosis experiment by the famous psychologist Hilgard, I didn't come up very hypnotizable. So
Okay.
It's not something I've experienced myself.
Okay, yeah, right. I know that, yeah, there is a controversy about that, but they're even trying to change the name. I heard in some circles, they don't want to call it hypnosis anymore. But
I hadn't heard that. How fascinating. I wonder what they'll do with the organizations that have hypnosis in their name. I guess they'll have to change that too.
Yeah, sometimes people call it phenomenological control.
Okay. Oh.
Sort of to get it on, I think, on board with like a more familiar linguist items like a cognitive control of experience.
Reminding me, they changed the name of multiple personality disorder to dissociative identity disorder. And, my reaction is, I don't care what you call it, just tell me that what is the evidence that really you can have 100 personalities, males, females, adults, kids, ducks, and other animals as your personality, and that it is caused by childhood abuse.
Right. I mean, I guess there is some evidence, right, that there was one case where one of the alters was blind, and the fMRI activity in their visual cortex was diminished when that alter was active, and when it wasn't. So maybe, I'm not sure what to think about dissociative identity disorder, but whether it's caused by childhood trauma, I think that's a different issue, actually.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, I think that the DID is real. You've got real people displaying these real symptoms. The question is, how did they get there?
Right. Exactly. And that's something I've seen in the repression discussion as well, is that they're trying to rename it. It's like, what is it? Memory dissociation.
Dissociative. It's dissociation, not repression. Yeah. Right. Because then they can point to the fact that dissociation is in the DSM, so therefore it's real. Well, dissociation is a big umbrella term. And again, there too, I say, whatever you want to call it, just show me the proof.
Right, exactly. Okay, so I do wonder at the end here if there's anything that you were hoping would come up that hasn't come up.
No, it's been a pleasure talking to you, but I think we've covered so much that you let me know if you have one of these individuals on so I can listen to the answers to your questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to actually look into that, and I will let you know. Well, thank you very much for joining me. It's been a great conversation, and I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Just hang out for a second. I'll say bye off the air. And other than that.
So I leave and you do whatever you're going to do.
Okay.
Okay.
Well,
bye, Richard.
You don't have to leave.